Oh, fantastic. So this is Maya Garmanza, the Delaware Riverkeeper with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I'm joined by Karen Verdon with FERC Fast Truth. And we are among the organizers of the FERC Lobby Day. Also, we have had assistance in organizing all of this from Paul Jarosky with Corn in Ohio, and he's actually viewing this call, and Peg Blick with Beyond Extreme Energy, as well as Lee Stewart's provided some support from Beyond Extreme Energy. So we just wanted to go through with you today some of the basics to expect next week at our lobby days. We're going to talk first a little bit about good lobby tactics, and then we're going to go through a set of slides that are going to be part of your materials next week that encompass some of the top priority messages we want to use in our meetings with the senators. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen.
Thanks, Maya. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me, Maya?
Yes.
Good. All right, great. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes, like Maya said, talking about some effective lobbying techniques for people who haven't gotten a lot of experience in lobbying. So the slides are basically set up depending on whether we're talking about prior to the meeting, during the meeting, or post-meeting, different things that we should be thinking about. So before the meeting, a lot of the things that are on this list are being covered today, but it's a good idea when you're getting ready to go to Washington, D.C. next week to make sure that your message is refined. You're never sure how long you're going to have in one of these meetings, so you want to make sure that your message is refined, that you have materials prepared to leave with the legislator, and you'll hear a lot more about that from Maya, and to be clear on the ask. And so, if there are things that you're able to learn about the senators who are on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee over the weekend, if you can kind of familiarize yourself with them, that would be fantastic. If you're going to visit your own senator while you're there, we're going to be trying to hit every office while we're there. So, just the most you can find out about where your own senators or where the committee members sit with respect to the issues, it would be helpful, but you're going to have a lot of information provided in advance. So if there's something additional you want to take along, be sure to prepare it over the weekend and be ready to have it with you on Monday or Tuesday if you're just coming down for Tuesday. So those are the things to get ready for in advance of the meeting. But once you're actually there, first of all, of course, it's important to be punctual. And because we're hitting a lot of offices, what we're going to try to do is go around as teams, but Maya will get into that. But it's a good idea to try to be together for a few minutes before we actually go into the office, just so we can all reconvene, make sure we're all there, and then go in, punctual, on time, looking professional. and so once we're in there, we should be introducing ourselves. And actually, there's a correction to the slide because since I wrote it, we now have more than 200 organizations on the list that we can refer to being a part of. So we are trying to present ourselves as part of a cohesive whole rather than Karen from Brooks Gas Truth or anything like that. So rather than representing our own organizations, we should talk about that we do represent a large group of organizations, more than 200 from across the country, who have come together to call for congressional hearings on FERC. And then we'll thank them for meeting with us. But then we have to state that purpose of the meeting, our position, and our ask very, very clearly up front. Again, like I said before, you don't really know how much time you're going to have for these meetings, and so it's good to get everything out on the table right away and then back it up with concrete reasons for your position and personal stories. There will be a number of people in any one of these meetings. We'd like to hear the story, so if you have one that you'd like to tell, make sure you've got it really crisp by the time you get to D.C., like no more than a minute or two, just because we're not going to have enough time for everybody to get a chance to speak and say too much, because we also have to provide time for questions, and we really want to give them a chance to ask us some questions. When they're asking, they might come up with something you don't know the answer to. Never feel embarrassed to say, I don't know, but I'll find out. It's actually a good way of establishing a relationship with them after the meeting. I'll talk about in a second, but as a general rule in life, never be embarrassed to say you don't know something, and you'll find out. You should definitely ask, and we will be doing this in every meeting, ask for their support. Just don't state what the ask is, but make it very personal. Direct it at them. Can we count on you for your support in opposing this hearing, for rejecting these nominees, for supporting the congressional hearings that we are calling for that would investigate FERC's abuses. Be clear about that you are putting them on the spot, asking them for their support, and then leave behind material. There will be a packet of things to take along. Like I said, if you have something additional about your own story you want to bring along, we should have some things to leave behind, but I'll get to that in a second again when we talk about the post-meeting, because there is a point to be made about that in follow-up. But then again, thank them for the meeting that they've had with you, and then in the days after, only waiting for a day or two, don't let it go too long, you should follow up with them. But right after the meeting, it's a really good idea to take a couple of minutes and jot down your impressions and some of the specific things they talked about, maybe questions that they asked. I'm just adding this because of a conversation we had earlier today to help share all of the information about all these meetings going on with the social media community. It's also maybe a good idea if you get a chance to get a shot with anybody in the office or in the hallway after. Maybe you can have some nice photos to share on social media to let everybody know that this is happening, because we want people to be calling at the same time. So, it would encourage people to keep involved. So I'm just tossing that additional point in there. But like I said, within a day or two, you want to send a thank you note, reminding them of the key messages, and be sure to include a link or some hard copy to a related resource. So, one of the things I actually do when I do these meetings is I deliberately leave something behind, and then when I'm in there, I say, you know what I should send you? And so I have an excuse to send them something, because I don't want to just send them a thank you that's maybe just got a couple of key messages. I really want them to connect to the issue again. And so I send them something short so that they're likely to look at it. But I send them something after the fact, a good photo or a fact sheet or something that's just something they're going to be more inclined to look at than a 35-page document. I send them something like that after the fact, so that they're connecting again. It's always a good idea to establish a rapport, like I said at the beginning, with these staffers in these offices, because it can be incredibly useful. And chances are, some of the people we'll be meeting with are going to be the people who actually work on energy issues for the senator. So it's really good to have those relationships established, even with the senators who don't agree with you. So try and make that connection last after the meeting. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Maya, but I'd be happy to take your questions about any of this at the end. Go ahead, Maya.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. And also, just to remind folks, the way we're going to do questions at the end of the presentation is via the chat box. So, if you have questions that come up as we're going through all of this, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll go back there later and answer them at the end of the presentation. Some more basics for Monday and Tuesday, depending on which day or days that you are coming. We have secured a meeting room, a conference room at the Public Citizens offices, which are just a few minutes away from the Senate office building. So this is going to serve as our staging area. And we are going to ask folks, when you arrive in D.C., the first place you should go, other than perhaps wherever it is you're staying, but in order to prepare for the lobby day, the first place you should go is to come to the conference room at the Public Citizens offices on 215 Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast. You see that on this slide. We're going to be there basically each day from about 9 o'clock. You see there Monday 9:30. Chances are we'll be there early, but we'll be there first thing in the morning. And have somebody there all day, so that whatever time you arrive, you can come check in at the Public Citizen Conference Room and get your assignments and all of your materials. Our earliest meeting on Monday is going to be at 10:30, or sorry, I think it's at 11. Anyway, our earliest meeting is going to be in that 10:30, 11 time frame. So if you are able to get to the Public Citizen offices at that 9 a.m., 9:30 time, we are going to sort of have an advanced review of everything just before folks head out. But if you can't be there first thing, if you're not going to arrive in D.C. until later on in the day, no worries. You've been through this webinar, or you're going to be part of a team, and so you can sort of learn the ropes as you go, because you're going to be spending all day with these folks. So we're going to have this meetup. When you get to the Public Citizen Conference Room, you're going to get a couple of things. You're going to get a packet of materials. Now, there's going to be packets that are given to the team leader that can be left at every one of the meetings and or drop-in meetings that take place. So we will have packets for all the Senate offices, but you're also going to have your own working packet that you can hang on to, go through throughout the course of the day, refer to during any conversation that you're having where you want to refer it. And that'll be your packet to take home if you choose to. You're also going to get a group assignment. We've set up teams. And so we're going to have groups going around, and you're going to be attending sort of every team's going to be attending two kinds of meetings. Every team's going to be attending some pre-scheduled meetings with certain Senate offices and their staff. Those meetings are probably going to be a little bit longer, and you're going to get FaceTime during that meeting. The rest of the time, the teams are going to be going around pre-assigned building floors, doing drop-ins, walking into the office, asking if there's a staff member available to spend a few minutes. Usually you get, maybe 5 minutes. Sometimes you get taken to a back room and you might get a little longer if they're really interested. But you get a few minutes to chat up a staff member and then give them our materials. Sometimes there's nobody to meet with you. Ideally, what you will do is ask if you can come back later to do a drop-in face-to-face, but if not, you might just leave your materials. Either way, by the time we get to the end of the 2 days, we wanted to have had some sort of direct contact with every single senator's offices in Washington, D.C. Every group is going to have a leader. The leader is going to be the one that's going to be expected to sort of start off the conversations that are taking place, make sure things get rolling right. But everybody who attends these meetings is going to have an opportunity to speak. You're not just wallpaper, right? You are an active participant in this process. So as Karen said, if you have something important to say, you should say it. If you have an important piece of information you want to bring, you should bring it. We've put together packets of sort of, I think, a really quality packet of really good information, but we, of course, were not able to include everything. And so, bring your own things to support your own messaging, and that will be of tremendous value. Amongst our materials is going to be a series of slides that I'm about to run through. Those slides are designed to help open up the dialogue in these meetings, particularly the pre-scheduled sit-down meetings where you're going to have a little bit of time. The idea is to give some visuals and some top-level messages to get the conversation going. I would not expect that you're going to get through the entire quote-unquote slideshow. It's not really a slideshow, but I wouldn't anticipate you're going to get through all of the slides, but it's going to be a great way to get the conversation going, to help highlight a few of the more important, easy-to-comprehend messages, and also it's going to be a great leave behind that's a little bit more compelling for the legislative staffer to look through than just sort of printed, written up materials. This slide that you see of the U.S. Marshals with the machine guns and the school bus going by, and the Marshals are actually there protecting the pipeline company from local residents who wanted to come and protest construction of the Constitution Pipeline Project. This is just our opener, sort of to lay the groundwork visually, not really intended for discussion, but to lay the groundwork visually of what communities are being exposed to as part of this abusive FERC review and approval process. Overall, what our message is going to be from all of these slides is that FERC is abusing communities. They are abusing their power. They are misusing the law in order to inflict incredible damage on communities across the nation. And as a result, what we are all calling for are congressional hearings into the abuses of power and law that are routinely inflicted by FERC, that Congress not only hold those hearings but identify reforms and put reforms in place, and that they undertake those hearings and put in place those reforms before they restore a quorum at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, because it is an untenable situation to allow things to move on business as usual, which is what will happen if a quorum is restored. So that being said, we want to urge senators, whether they're on the committee or off the committee, we want to urge them to take a posture of opposition to the Trump nominees. Maybe it's because you want them to oppose the specific nominee because, you know, they're inappropriate for the seat. But I think also just more generally, we want them to oppose all nominees because as history has shown us, nobody good can ever get onto take a FERC commissioner seat and result in a change of behavior at that agency. Whoever gets appointed as commissioner, it's just business as usual in terms of the abuses. Knowing that we have these hearings into the two Trump nominees coming up on May 25th, the other thing that we want to ask senators who are on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee to do is use the hearings as an opportunity to demonstrate the many ways that FERC is abusing its power, misusing the law, harming communities, and to make the point that congressional hearings and reforms are absolutely necessary. So there's sort of three asks. Use the hearings to highlight the abuses as FERC, and for senators to call for congressional hearings and reforms before a quorum is restored, and for senators to take a position to oppose the nominees that are being put forth at the hearings later that week. This slide really represents the point that people are being stripped of their legal rights to challenge pipeline approvals by FERC at a meaningful time and in a meaningful way. This raises the opportunity to talk about tolling orders, how when FERC issues an approval of a pipeline project before a community or a property owner whose property is about to be taken by eminent domain has the ability to go into court to challenge that approval by FERC, they have to submit something called a rehearing order. And FERC has to actually approve or deny that rehearing order in order to grant that right to go to court. What FERC does is rather than grant or deny the rehearing order, they issue something called a tolling order, which says that they will accept the rehearing request and they will think about it. And then they proceed to think about it for many, many months, sometimes over a year, placing the requester into legal limbo, placing the community, the property owner, the concerned resident into legal limbo. And while they have been placed in legal limbo by FERC, FERC proceeds to allow the pipeline company to exercise the power of eminent domain and to approve the pipeline project actually going into construction and in some cases into operation. The ramifications of this is that, right, pipeline property is being taken and pipelines are being built before the legal challenge can take place. And so when a legal challenge is brought, it's simply not timely. So even in the case of a situation like the Northeast Upgrade Project, where the court actually sided with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and determined that FERC had violated federal law in approving the Northeast Upgrade Project, they had allowed the use of, that they had violated the law. By the time that legal victory was achieved, the pipeline was fully constructed and in operation. Another example is that you'll see highlighted on the screen. I don't expect you, by the way, to say all of this during the meeting. I'm just alerting you to what is on these slides so that you're fully aware and can pick out the pieces that resonate with you. But for the Transco Leidy Southeast project, a tolling order placed communities into legal limbo for 15 months. And during that 15-month period, the power of eminent domain was exercised, and FERC issued 20 notices for the pipeline project to proceed through phases of construction and ultimately through phases of operation. And again, all of that happened during that legal limbo time period. For the Constitution pipeline, you see at the bottom, that tolling order legal limbo period was 12 months long. For the Algonquin incremental market pipeline, the tolling order was for 9 months. Just 4 examples there of how extreme the wait time is as a result of these tolling orders, with FERC, again, mainly putting people into legal limbo, preventing them from challenging these pipeline projects at a meaningful time and in a meaningful way. The next slide is just a demonstration of how FERC misuses or mimics the requirements of the law not to engage in segmentation. This is a map that was on the FERC docket for the Northeast Upgrade Project. You can see that single line, which represents, in fact, a single pipeline. But you can see the multiple colored hashes. Each different color represents a different quote-unquote pipeline project that was placed before FERC for review and approval. And so that single pipeline was actually broken up into 4 pieces, each piece being advanced before FERC for individual review and approval by the agency. And in fact, all 4 of those pieces were before FERC during overlapping time periods. So there's no question that FERC fully understood that it had a single project that was segmented into 4 pieces in order to undermine the full scope of its review and approval. And this is actually the pipeline project that was the subject of the legal victory that the Delaware Riverkeeper Network had brought that I referred to in the last slide. But by the time we won that victory, that very large pipeline was fully constructed and in operation. And FERC continues today, despite this legal decision, to engage in the practice of ill segmentation. We also know from looking at records that FERC consistently overlooks violations of community and environmental protection laws by pipeline projects. And in fact, what we have seen from the record is that FERC has never sought a penalty for violations during construction, operation, and or maintenance of a pipeline project. And that when violations of environmental laws are in fact identified on the ground, not only does FERC not issue an order for penalties after the fact, but they don't order the pipeline company to stop construction, to clean up the mess, to remedy the environmental degradation before they're allowed to continue with their construction. They just allow the pipeline company to continue business as usual while the environmental damage continues for some undetermined period of time. A good example of how extreme this can be is lower down on that slide. We pulled the Tennessee Gas Pipeline Company 300 line as an example. In that instance, what we can see from the record is that over a 2-year period in just one county, local officials identified and documented 84 violations of environmental protection laws. FERC did not seek a single penalty for those violations. Similarly, the Columbia 1278 pipeline, over a 1-year period in just one county, local officials documented 73 violations. Again, FERC sought no penalties. So you can see how extreme the oversight is, the misuse of their ability to overlook these violations is. This graphic is of the Constitution Pipeline Project and represents FERC stripping states of their right to review and approve or reject pipeline projects before FERC issues a certificate of public convenience and necessity for the project, before FERC itself approves the project. What we've provided on this slide is the black letter law, the language of the Clean Water Act Section 401, which plainly states that no federal license or permit shall be granted until the certification, here the Clean Water Act certification, has been granted or waived by the state. Despite this clear statement of law in the Clean Water Act, FERC routinely leapfrogs over the states, issues the FERC approval before the states are allowed to act. and in many instances at the same time allows the pipeline company again to engage in the power of eminent domain and go through several phases of construction while the state is still undertaking its review. And this is really an undermining, a stripping of the state's right to say no if it wants to say no, or to say yes with qualifications if it wants to say yes with qualifications. A good example of how this is so damaging is, again, the Constitution Pipeline Project, where FERC granted its certification before both Pennsylvania and New York, the two affected states, issued their 401 certifications for the project. It then allowed the pipeline to go into construction on the Pennsylvania portion of the project after the state issued its 401 certification, but before New York had issued its 401 certification. So in essence, New York had not yet, well, not in essence, in reality, New York had not yet ruled. Despite that, FERC allowed the project to go into construction. The end result was that FERC actually, or that New York rejected its approval of this pipeline project. This pipeline project remains unapproved and unable to be completed, and yet all those property owners in New York and Pennsylvania who had their property taken by the power of eminent domain are really left without a remedy for how to address that taking. And then all of the environmental damage that was undertaken remains unaddressed and unremediable. In the case of the Hollerins, that's a good example of other ways that communities get harmed by this process. Here, the Hollerins had a maple syrup business that was dependent upon the maple trees in the forest that FERC allowed to be almost entirely cut. And so for the Hollerins, they lost their property rights, they lost the beautiful forest that they loved and had been in their family for nearly 70 years, and they lost their maple syrup business, inflicting economic harm on them and their community. Karen, do you want to speak to your climate changing slide?
Sure, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So this is a photo a lot of people would probably recognize using a FLIR camera to see the methane emissions from a compressor station. And so the whole point of having this slide included here is that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has taken the stance that they don't believe climate issues are within their purview with respect to, for instance, all of the methane emissions that would be released along the pipeline route itself at compressor stations, or really even the upstream emissions. They acknowledge them, but they say they don't believe it's in their purview to take that into account while they're approving a pipeline project, which makes no sense whatsoever. And I would just add that given who we know who the nominees are, we know, for instance, that Neil Chatterjee is a climate denier. So, so when we're talking about our more general messaging about rejecting the nominees, insisting on these hearings, we could say that this, body would take a more serious turn in the direction of climate denial if people like that were admitted to it. So, we need these kinds of abuses, these kinds of decisions on FERC's part to just overlook the biggest single crisis we're facing as a planet because they just don't think it's in their purview. We have to straighten that kind of thing out long before you can add somebody else, especially if that person's going to be a climate denier.
So the next slide is a picture of James Baker's home after it was destroyed by the explosion of a fracked gas pipeline project that ran nearby his home. Not only was his home destroyed, but James Baker himself was incredibly damaged by the explosion. He was burned over a large proportion of his body. He lost limbs and really suffered as a result of this project. Thankfully, his wife and his newborn child were not in the house at the same time, or they too would have been devastated. This slide really is the opportunity to raise that bigger conversation that there are many harmful impacts to our communities, to our environment that are inflicted by these pipeline projects that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission knowingly, intentionally overlooks in its review and approval process. It overlooks, it ignores these public health and safety issues. It overlooks and ignores the climate changing impacts that Karen spoke to. It overlooks and ignores the economic harms, like harms to people like the Hollerins, like the loss of successful farming that results after a pipeline project is constructed through a farm field. It really intentionally overlooks and ignores the adverse impacts to ecotourism, recreation, quality of life. There are so many harms inflicted by pipeline projects that FERC just refuses to consider. They refuse to consider, for example, the AIM pipeline and the potential of having an explosion of that pipeline, knowing that it's being placed in too close proximity to a nuclear power plant. You know, what would be the potential health and safety ramifications of an accident, incident, or explosion there that could trigger a catastrophic event linked with that nuclear power plant. So this slide just allows you to open up the door to the universe of concerns that are routinely brought before FERC during the public review process that they just blatantly ignore and set aside. The next two slides really just have a lot of words because it was hard to come up with a graphic for them. So I'm not really expecting anybody to talk to them too much, but you might want to. These slides, the first slide is just a series of newspaper quotes and examples talked about in the newspaper where we can see that the FERC commissioners and FERC employees are routinely engaged in self-serving decision-making. We have the employee revolving door between the agency and the industry, and employees at FERC very quickly going, you know, after they've worked on a particular project, you know, getting plush jobs with the industry and vice versa. Stories of FERC commissioners that are issuing rulings, decisions on pipeline projects where their family members are working for the company that is working for or with or in some way representing the company through the pipeline review and approval process. So it's just an opportunity to talk about how we have incredible conflicts of interest and self-serving decision-making that's taking place at FERC that really needs to be investigated, that has been well documented and investigated by the newspapers, but continues to be ignored by the agency itself and also by Congress. The next slide is the opportunity to talk about the conflict of interest that communities experience with the third-party consultants that are hired by FERC. FERC routinely hires a consultant to help in their review and approval of one pipeline project, knowing full well that that same consultant is working for the same company, but in a private capacity, perhaps on another pipeline project, or sometimes on a very directly connected pipeline project. So there's an incredible conflict of interest there because literally the consultant is working both sides of the aisle there. So this is your opportunity to talk about that, especially if yours is one of those pipelines where you've been able to document this kind of conflict of interest. This slide is really just, you know, to open up the opportunity for that positive message. If you want to bring that through, if that seems like it's important for your meeting, to talk about how clean energy options are truly available today. That and that if your concern is the environment, or if your concern is the economy, if your concern is jobs, that you, Senator, should be more interested in advancing clean energy options and ensuring a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that is, during its review and approval process, considering whether or not there are clean energy alternatives for supporting the clean energy needs that are supposedly to be fulfilled by a proposed infrastructure project. Routinely, FERC ignores the clean energy alternative. So this is the opportunity to explore that and to tell that senator, you know, we need that reform put in place. We don't just want FERC to be encouraged to consider the clean energy alternative for a particular identified energy need, but we want it mandated that they have to consider whether or not there's a clean energy option. This slide was provided by Paul. You don't really have to speak to it. You just have to look at it. I mean, this is a demonstration for the senator, for their staff, of just how on every level the community is abused by these pipeline companies and their staffing. Here it's the big middle finger, the big FU, which is what the pipeline companies say to the communities, and really truthfully is what FERC says to the communities throughout these review and approval processes. This slide, this one comes compliments of Paul with some additions from Karen and I. It's really just an opportunity, a summary slide. You don't have to go through the bullet items, but it just talks about, in bullet form, highlight some of the bigger abuses, the use of tolling orders, the undermining of states' rights, the granting of construction approval before all permits have been secured by a pipeline company, not just from the states, but from other agencies. The failure to fully consider all the impacts of a pipeline project. The incredible abusive use of the power of eminent domain to advance a pipeline project that clearly is not for the greater public good, but is simply designed to advance the private interests of the pipeline company themselves. And then it also provides a link to the dossier to highlight for the senator if you want to learn more information about these issues and more, get some examples, get some concrete documentation to back up our claims that there are all these abuses and abuses of power and misuses of law. You can go to this dossier. If you want to have a clearer slide for that, here's another link with the dossier, but also a link to the people's hearing page, so that if senators or their staff want to hear the testimony of the people abused by these pipeline companies, if you yourself was amongst the testifiers, you might really want to encourage them to go look at the video and hear what people are saying, hear what people are experiencing across the nation. And again, this is going to be part of the Leave Behind packet, and it's just intended to create some attractive visuals, some short messaging and short examples that can be left behind with the legislators, and to help you pick out one or two of your favorite issues and have a visual to go along with it if it becomes a topic of discussion. With that, we are going to open up the chat box, or look for open up the opportunity for questions and answers, either about the day, about the messages, or anything else that you want to ask about this effort. If you could just type it in the chat box, Bridget will keep an eye open and we'll answer them. All right, so we're not seeing any questions. Oh, yes we are. Any advice on how to counter arguments that we are just NIMBY? First and foremost, I would just say there's nothing wrong with being NIMBY. If you're not going to fight for your own community, if you're not going to fight for your own property, if you're not going to fight for the future of your kids, who is, right? So I think it's very important to dispel the notion that fighting to protect yourself, your family, and your community is a bad thing. It's just not true. That's a good thing. But also to simply make very clear that the communities that are coming together across the nation are in these battles are involving not just the property owners where the pipelines are going, but really people from around the region who simply don't want to see the pipeline going in anywhere in their community, because they understand that it's going to have adverse impacts for the entire region. And for many people who are involved in this battle, it really is about the bigger picture, about climate change, about future generations, and about locking our country into a fossil fuel future rather than getting us on that clean energy path. So I would just take it head on. And make very clear that the folks that we are representing across the nation are not just the people who are literally getting these pipelines in their backyards, but it's a wealth of individuals and organizations that are coming together collectively because as a collective, we are opposed to this path for the present and future of our nation. Karen, do you want to add something?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I keep just muting and unmuting. I just want to make sure. Yeah, the thing is that this is a long-standing problem with FERC. We have had these problems for years and years and years, and Maya just gave you a whole bunch of great examples of things that have gone on over a span of time, so that, this idea that anybody would try to, pigeonhole our thinking into, just a group of people who are concerned about their own community. Well, even if that's the case, like Maya said, there's nothing wrong with protecting your own community or your own property. But, how is it that there's been this pattern of abuse? I think the pattern is what is so important to say, that this is a collective coming together to bring you what is a long-standing pattern of abuse by this agency for whatever motivation.
So I think we've gotten a couple more. Somebody is asking, or Anna asking, we'll ask directly if the senators will support us. What do you say to the senators if they directly say no?
I can take that one. I would thank them for their time and say, we hope that they'll reconsider. But, the whole idea is to broach the subject with them, get an assessment of where they stand. If they come right out and say no, I seriously doubt they're persuadable if you spend 5 more minutes arguing with them, honestly. So I think it's moreover to help us, and that's one of the reasons for writing down the notes afterwards. If you got a firm no from somebody, that helps us to know almost where the votes are and that sort of thing. But, you can always encourage them to rethink, and that you'll send them some additional information, and you hope that they'll look at it and consider it.
Yeah, and it's also always important to recognize, right, in all of these battles, whether it's this battle or any other, very often getting a decision maker to get to the right place in terms of decision making takes time, right? And it's an incremental effort to pull them along from where they were to where we need them to be. So they might be a firm no today, absolutely. You've put this information in their minds. You've expressed to them the concerns of communities and given them real-world examples of what's actually happening. So in a week, in a month, in a year, when somebody from their community comes to them and says, this is happening right now in my backyard, and I want you to come experience it, and you come and see it, maybe we have laid the foundation for them to change their mind in the moment at that future time when they're, more directly confronted with it. So a no today sucks, but it wasn't a waste of time because as Karen knows, one, we've gathered good intelligence that helps us in our strategizing in the future, but two, we've been part of laying the foundation for hopefully a changed mind in the future. And you just never know when, if, or how that will happen. So we always have to keep trying.
I just wanted to add really quickly that what we're asking for, since we're asking for congressional hearings, getting a no on that doesn't mean you're losing the war. I mean, if they're not supportive of that, like Maya just said, that's somebody we can target in the future, or that's somebody that individuals in their own communities, their own constituents will target in the future. So it's still, like Maya just said, it raises the issue in their minds whether they say no to the hearings themselves. Shouldn't be an indication of any sort of loss or failure. That's how it goes. So I think we should just know who we're talking to and be prepared. And I kind of think we'll be talking to staffers, anybody who probably wouldn't say anything definitive, but we might hear some no's, and we should be prepared for that, and it's fine.
Okay, so we've gotten a couple questions about eminent domain messaging. One is, how can we argue that national infrastructure can be built without eminent domain? And another is, didn't Congress try to pass anti-eminent domain legislation after the Supreme Court ruled on this a few years ago?
You want to go first, Karen, or you want me to go first?
Go ahead. I didn't quite hear the second question. That's why I also didn't say anything. Could you?
Sorry. Didn't Congress try to pass anti-eminent domain legislation after the,
Thank you. Sorry.
So in terms of anti-eminent domain legislation, I don't firmly have that in my brain what you have, what you're referring to, but I don't think that there's been any serious forward movement effort that would address address this issue. I do know there's currently, though, underway an effort to seek to advance eminent domain, productive, helpful eminent domain legislation in the future. So keep your eyes open for that, because that could be an important part of the solution. Surely there's going to be an argument that you have to have the power of eminent domain to, pass a pipeline across the country. That doesn't mean it's right, that doesn't mean it's okay, and that doesn't mean that it should be allowed to happen. It really is not appropriate to sacrifice James Baker's family so somebody else somewhere else across the nation can get a drop of gas when in fact their energy needs could be supported and fueled by clean energy options, right? So, but also you can just bring it back for the purposes of this this lobbying effort. You can really say, Senator or Senator staff, that is a debate for another day. What we are talking with you about today is about the many ways that FERC is abusing their power so that the power of eminent domain is so that companies and FERC are overstepping in their use of the power of eminent domain, and really use the Hollerons as an example. That was an incredible overreach by the agency to allow a company to use the power of eminent domain and then to go into construction of a pipeline project that had not yet received all of its approvals from all the entities, including the state of New York, that needs to review and approve that project before it could be fully constructed. And as a result, that family lost their property, lost their nature, and lost their business for a pipeline project that will probably never be built. That's an incredible overreach. So you can sort of pull them back and say, and doesn't that senator or senator staffer, doesn't that demand investigation as to how that was allowed to happen? And note that it wasn't just the Hollerons along the length of the Constitution Pipeline project. There were families and business owners all up and down that proposed pipeline project that lost their property rights for a pipeline that will never be built, right? And this is playing out time and time again in a whole host load of different ways for projects across the nation. That needs to be investigated by Congress. Reforms need to be identified and put in place. And yes, Senator staffer, perhaps at the end of the day, you and I may ultimately disagree on, to what extent the power of eminent domain should be allowed for these kinds of pipeline projects. But surely we can agree that allowing the exercise of eminent domain authority for a project that will never be built is wholly inappropriate, right? You want to add something, Karen?
Yeah, I wanted to add that the way eminent domain was conceived was to give government, to give at least a government contractor, like somebody working to build a highway project on behalf of PennDOT here in Pennsylvania, let's say, that power of eminent domain to get the job done for the public benefit. There's no public benefit in this. They never have to establish, except for their own self-interest, that being a richer company is going to somehow benefit the public or something. So it starts out, with those protections put in place to make it something that should be used sparingly. That's sort of the idea of eminent domain, is that governments need to do this sometimes. But once you start blurring that line between public, projects and private projects that, just fatten the bottom line for a corporation, you're already starting, violating the sense of what eminent domain is supposed to be, which people don't like under any circumstance. And then when you apply it so sloppily, and you do things like I just described with the Hollerons and everybody else along that line, and we have different versions of it on other pipeline projects, when you start doing things like that, it's completely unforgivable. So I would think that, people should be challenged to if you're talking to staffers who question eminent domain, I would push right back and say, why are private corporations being given this ability in the first place? Even when the project's completed, why is that happening? It's supposed to be used sparingly.
So there's one question left if we have time. Can we argue that foreign use of transported fuels should not be supported by FERC?
And Karen, I'm going to let you answer that because that's really a tag along of your public purpose argument that you just so beautifully articulated.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what's especially crazy since they also do approve LNG facilities, is that they are setting the stage for a climate-killing business plan to be able to be executed upon, where these companies can send gas from the United States overseas to the highest bidder, which would have all sorts of ramifications, of course, on this side with pricing and other things in addition to the climate impact. But, once again, there is an absolute abuse of eminent domain because that's all part of it. These pipelines are, getting the power, they were using the pipeline companies are using the power of an eminent domain to build something that could conceivably connect to something that would liquefy the gas and ship it overseas, because it's been really challenging to figure out why we have a need for natural gas anywhere in this country. There's no shortage. We know what the business plan is. And so, absolutely, if we get the chance to talk about LNG and to say that this is something that is an additional problem with all of the things we're already talking about, especially eminent domain because it is so connected, they absolutely shouldn't be sending anything overseas. FERC should never be approving these plans. And they really shouldn't be approving any pipeline that could conceivably be connected to one of those plants.
Great. So it looks like somebody typing another question. Charlie? Oh, okay. Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Charlie, for the thank you. That's a great note to end this session on. We really appreciate everybody joining us. These were great questions. And we look forward to seeing everybody next week, Monday, Tuesday, or both days, as we go forth and make these arguments together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.